Imagine walking down the aisle, the white lace of your dress trailing behind you, while the man holding your arm whispers that you're a bastard under his breath. For 28 years, that was my reality. My name is Sierra. I'm a 28-year-old architectural designer, and for my entire life, I've been a stranger in my own home. I have emerald green eyes and copper hair, traits that neither of my parents possesses. To my father, Marcus, those traits weren't just a quirk of genetics, they were a crime scene. He spent nearly 3 decades accusing my mother of a betrayal she swore never happened, treating me like a living, breathing piece of evidence of her supposed infidelity. The tension in our house was a permanent resident. While other dads took their daughters to father-daughter dances, mine stayed in the car, refusing to be seen with another man's mistake. He provided the bare minimum, his eyes always narrowed in suspicion every time I excelled or failed. He told me I had the blood of a liar in my veins. My mother, Sarah, lived in a state of perpetual apology, her spirit crushed by decades of his verbal vitriol. But the breaking point came 6 months ago, when I got engaged to the love of my life, Julian. Marcus didn't congratulate us. He didn't offer a toast. Instead, he dropped an ultimatum that felt like a grenade in the middle of our engagement dinner. He told me that he would not humiliate himself by walking a child of sin down the aisle unless I submitted to a DNA test. He wanted the world to see the truth before he handed me off. He wanted to finally expose my mother's 28-year-old secret in front of everyone. I was tired of running. I was tired of my mother crying in the kitchen while he threw accusations like stones. So, I agreed. But I didn't just agree to a secret lab test. I agreed to have the results delivered during our formal rehearsal dinner, in front of 60 of our closest relatives and friends. Hold on. Before we get into the real stuff, I want to know, what are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments. Are you driving, cooking, maybe hiding from work? Let me know. I thought the test would simply prove my mother's innocence and force my father to finally see me as his daughter. I thought it would be the end of the affair child insults. I was prepared for a tearful apology and a late start at a relationship. What I wasn't prepared for was the email that hit my inbox 3 days before the dinner. When I opened that PDF, my heart didn't just skip a beat. It stopped. The results didn't just say Marcus wasn't my father. They said Sarah wasn't my mother. I sat in my dark apartment, staring at the screen until the pixels burned into my retinas. I wasn't an affair child. I wasn't a mistake. According to the science, I didn't belong to either of the people who raised me. The woman who had endured decades of abuse to protect me wasn't my biological mother, and the man who hated me for my unknown father was actually hating a ghost. My mind raced back to the hospital in Portland where I was born, a night of a massive power outage and a chaotic ward. I had 2 choices. I could tell them privately and cancel the dinner, or I could let Marcus have exactly what he asked for, the truth. And I wanted him to feel the full weight of it. I wanted the audience. I wanted the witnesses. I spent the next 48 hours digging into hospital records and hiring a private investigator to find the piece of the puzzle that was missing. By the time the rehearsal dinner arrived, I wasn't just a bride-to-be, I was a woman holding a detonator. As Marcus stood up to give his big reveal speech, clutching a printed envelope he thought contained my mother's confession, I looked him dead in the eye and smiled. He had no idea that the crime he'd spent 28 years obsessed with was far darker than an affair. The air in the private dining room was thick with a tension you could practically carve with a steak knife. 60 guests, grandparents, cousins, and Julian's entire family, sat in hushed silence as Marcus tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The ringing sound felt like a death knell. He stood at the head of the table, looking smug, his chest puffed out like a man who had finally won a marathon. My mother, Sarah, sat beside him, her head bowed, her hands trembling so violently she had to hide them under the white linen tablecloth. She looked like a woman awaiting a public execution for a crime she knew she hadn't committed. Marcus cleared his throat. his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. "We've spent 28 years living a lie," he began, his voice booming with a terrifying sense of authority. "Sierra, you wanted me to walk you down that aisle. You wanted me to give you my blessing. But I've always said that a man's honor is his most valuable possession. I couldn't give my name to someone who wasn't truly mine." I watched Julian reach for my hand under the table, his grip firm and supportive. He knew what was in the envelope I was holding. He was the only one. "I demanded the truth," Marcus continued, waving a sealed envelope in the air. "And tonight, in front of the people who matter, we are going to close this chapter of deceit. Sarah, I hope you're ready to finally admit what you did in the summer of '98. My mother let out a small, broken sob. The room was deathly quiet. People were looking away, embarrassed to be witnesses to such a brutal family takedown. Marcus ripped the envelope open with a flourish, his eyes scanning the pages for the words, 0% probability of paternity. He wanted to see those numbers. He wanted to scream them at us. But as he read, the smirk on his face didn't just fade. It curdled. His brow furrowed. He turned the page over, then back again. He looked at my mother, then at me, then back at the paper. This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice losing its thunder. "The lab. They must have switched the samples. This isn't possible." He looked like he'd been struck by lightning while standing perfectly still. He wasn't seeing the proof of an affair. He was seeing a void. "What's the matter, Dad?" I asked, my voice steady and cold. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sharp screech. "Is the truth not what you expected? Did the bastard child not have another man's DNA?" He looked at me, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray. He couldn't speak. He just dropped the papers onto the table as if they were burning his skin. My aunt reached out and grabbed them, her eyes widening as she read the results aloud to the surrounding guests. "Probability of paternity, 0%, she whispered. The room gasped. Marcus let out a guttural sound of triumph. He thought he'd finally caught my mother. "I knew it," he barked, trying to regain his footing. "I knew she cheated. You hear that? She's not mine." He pointed a shaking finger at my mother, who was now weeping openly. But then my aunt continued, her voice trembling. "Wait. Probability of maternity, 0%? Sierra. Sarah isn't your mother either?" The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of an entire family history collapsing in real time. My father's triumph vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at my mother, who was staring at the papers in total shock. If I wasn't her daughter, then where was her baby? And if I wasn't his daughter, who was I? The revenge I had planned was starting to take shape, but the look of pure agony on my mother's face almost made me stop. Almost. But then I remembered the 28 years of accidents and mistakes Marcus had called me. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a second set of documents, the ones I had spent the last 48 hours securing with the help of a private investigator and a contact at the hospital. "You spent 28 years hating me for being the evidence of an affair, Marcus," I said, dropping the dad title like a heavy weight. "But while you were busy accusing Mom of cheating, you never stopped to ask why the hospital records from the night of the Portland blackout were sealed. You were so blinded by your own ego that you didn't realize the truth was much worse than a lie." I walked toward him, the 60 relatives watching every step I took. I placed the second envelope in front of him. "If I'm not your daughter, and I'm not Mom's daughter, then who is the girl who is yours? And more importantly, where has she been while you were busy making my life a living hell?" As Marcus's hand shook while opening the second envelope, the real horror began to dawn on everyone in the room. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a tragedy that was about to go nationwide. The second envelope hit the table with a heavy thud. Marcus looked at it as if it were a coiled snake. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sweating panic that seemed to shrink him in his chair. Around us, the 60 relatives were no longer just guests. They were a jury. I saw my mother's eyes dart between me and the envelope, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. She wasn't just losing a daughter in that moment. She was realizing she might have lost a child 28 years ago without ever knowing it. "Open it, Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through the stifled murmurs of the room like a blade. "You wanted the truth. You demanded it. You made it the condition for my wedding. So don't stop now." With trembling fingers, he tore the flap. He pulled out the documents I'd spent a small fortune to expedite. The archived shift logs from the night of the Great Portland Blackout, and the birth registry that had been buried under decades of administrative red tape. As he read the names, his face went from gray to a sickly, translucent white. He hit the part where the private investigator had tracked the other birth from that night, a girl born just 3 minutes after me in the same ward, during the height of the power failure. In the chaos of the backup generators failing, 2 plastic bassinet tags had been swapped. 2 babies, both with tufts of dark hair at birth, had been handed to the wrong sets of parents. "Her name is Chloe," I whispered, the name echoing in the silent hall. "She grew up 3 towns over. She doesn't have emerald eyes or copper hair, Marcus. She looks exactly like you. She has your chin, your height, and your temperament." I pulled out a photograph the investigator had snapped of a woman standing outside a local library. The resemblance was haunting. She was the mirror image of my father's sisters. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. It was the weight of 28 years of misplaced hatred. My father had spent 3 decades punishing me for a sin that never happened, while his biological daughter was being raised by strangers just 20 miles away. He had looked at me every single day and seen a traitor, when all he was actually looking at was a victim of a hospital's negligence. My mother let out a cry that I will never forget, a sound of soul-deep grief. "My baby," she choked out, reaching for the photo. You let him treat Sierra like garbage for 30 years because you thought I was a liar? And all this time, my daughter was out there?" She stood up, her grief turning into a white-hot rage I had never seen from her. She looked at Marcus, not with fear, but with utter loathing. Marcus looked up at me, his eyes finally filling with tears. But they weren't for me. They were for his pride. "Sierra, I didn't know," he began, his voice cracking. He reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back, the movement sharp and deliberate. "You didn't want to know," I retorted. "You preferred the lie because it gave you power. It gave you an excuse to be a monster to a child. You called me a bastard at my own engagement dinner, Marcus. You told me I had the blood of a liar." I leaned in closer, so only he could hear the next part. "But here's the best part of the truth. Chloe, your biological daughter? I've already spoken to her." The room collectively held its breath. Marcus's eyes widened. You met her? Does she know about me?" I smiled, and for the first time in 28 years, I felt like the one in control. "Oh, she knows everything." I told her about the man who obsessed over DNA for 3 decades. I told her about the father who was so convinced of a betrayal that he missed his own daughter's life. And do you want to know what she said, Marcus? The suspense in the room was a physical thing now, a cord stretched to the breaking point. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Marcus looked at me, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of hope, a sign that his biological daughter was waiting in the wings to embrace the father she'd never known. He actually leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table until his knuckles turned white. He was desperate for a redemption arc he hadn't earned. "What did she say, Sierra?" he whispered, his voice cracking with a pathetic kind of longing. Does she want to meet me?" I let the silence hang for a 5 count, letting the weight of his 28 years of cruelty settle in the air. Then, I leaned in close, my voice cold as a winter morning. "She said she's seen your type before," I told him, loud enough for the first 3 rows of relatives to hear. "She's a social worker, Marcus. She spends her days protecting children from men exactly like you. When I showed her the videos of how you spoke to me, the recordings I took on my phone over the years, she didn't see a father. She saw a predator. She told me she has no interest in meeting a man who would treat any child, biological or not, with such systematic hatred." Marcus collapsed back into his chair, as if I'd physically struck him. The big reveal he had planned to humiliate my mother had turned into a public autopsy of his own character. My mother, Sarah, was staring at the photo of Chloe, tears streaming down her face. Not for the husband who had abused her, but for the daughter she had missed. But then, she looked at me. Really looked at me. And in that moment, the biological bond didn't matter. She saw the girl she had raised, the girl who had stood by her through every one of Marcus's rages. "But that's not the best part," I continued, turning to the room full of witnesses. "You see, Marcus was so sure I was a mistake that he actually looked into my inheritance rights months ago. He wanted to make sure that if the DNA test proved I wasn't his, I wouldn't get a dime of the family estate. He even had his lawyer draft a disinheritance clause based on fraudulent paternity." A murmur of disgust rippled through the guests. My grandfather, Marcus's own father, stood up, his face reddened with shame. "Is this true, Marcus? You tried to legally cast her out before even knowing the truth?" Marcus couldn't even look his father in the eye. He just stared at the floor, a broken shell of a man. But I wasn't done. This was a revenge story, and the final blow was yet to land. "Since Marcus was so concerned about legal bloodlines," I said, pulling one final document from my bag, "I decided to help him out. I contacted the hospital's legal department with the DNA evidence. They are, of course, terrified of a massive negligence lawsuit. To settle quietly, they've provided full documentation of the switch." I turned back to Marcus, who was now trembling. "Because you legally challenged my status as your daughter based on DNA, you effectively severed our legal tie. But here's the kicker. Under the state's legacy laws, since you are not my legal or biological father, you no longer have any claim to the trust my maternal grandmother, Sarah's mother, left for her firstborn descendant. That trust was predicated on the child Sarah brought home from the hospital." I paused, letting the financial reality sink in. Marcus had spent his life obsessed with money and honor. "By proving I wasn't yours, you accidentally proved you have no legal right to the home we grew up in, which was bought with that trust money. And since Mom is filing for divorce tomorrow morning..." I looked at my mother, who nodded slowly, her jaw set in a line of newfound strength. "You aren't just losing a daughter today, Marcus," I said. "You're losing everything. The house, the money, and the reputation you tried so hard to protect. You're going to leave this room exactly how you lived your life, completely alone." Marcus looked around the room, searching for a single ally, but his brothers looked away. His mother covered her face with a napkin. He had spent 28 years building a cage for us, but the door had just slammed shut on him. He stood up, stumbling slightly, and tried to grab my mother's hand. "Sarah, please. It was a mistake. We can find Chloe together. We can be a family." My mother stood up, and for the first time in my life she didn't look down. She looked him straight in the eye and delivered the line that ended it all. "But before I tell you what she said, you need to know what happened when the door to the banquet hall opened, and a surprise guest walked in. The heavy oak doors of the banquet hall swung open, and the room went deathly silent. Standing there was a woman who looked like she had stepped right out of my father's own reflection. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing gaze, and the same unmistakable stature. It was Chloe. The room gasped in unison, a collective intake of breath that felt like a vacuum. Marcus stumbled toward her, his arms outstretched, tears finally streaming down his face. "My daughter," he choked out, his voice thick with a desperate, unearned hope. You came for me." Chloe didn't move. She didn't smile. She stood there, with a professional, chilling detachment that mirrored the architectural precision I had used to dismantle my father's life. "I didn't come for you, Marcus," she said, her voice steady and resonant. She walked right past him, her heels clicking on the floor, and stopped in front of my mother. "I came for her." She reached out and took my mother's trembling hands. I grew up with parents who loved me, but I always felt like a piece of the puzzle was missing. Sierra told me about the woman who endured 30 years of hell to protect a child she thought was hers. I wanted to meet the woman who truly knows the meaning of motherhood. Marcus stood frozen in the middle of the room, his arms still half extended, looking like a statue of a forgotten god. He was a stranger to everyone in that room. "But I'm your father," he whispered, his ego still trying to claw its way back to the surface. Chloe turned her head just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "A father is someone who protects his child, not someone who uses them as a target for his own insecurities. You didn't want a daughter, Marcus. You wanted a victim. And today, your reign is over." She looked back at me and gave a small, knowing nod. We weren't sisters by blood, but we were sisters by a shared history of his shadow. The aftermath was a whirlwind of justice. My mother filed for divorce the very next morning, and thanks to the DNA evidence and the fraudulent paternity clauses Marcus himself had initiated, he was stripped of his claim to the family home and the trust. He moved into a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, living off a meager pension, while the 60 relatives who had witnessed his downfall haven't spoken to him since. He spends his days calling Chloe's office, but she has a permanent restraining order against him. As for me, I walked down that aisle 3 days later, but I didn't walk down it with Marcus. I walked down it alone, my head held high, with my mother and Chloe sitting together in the front row, cheering the loudest. I realized that family isn't about whose blood runs through your veins. It's about who stands by you when the lights go out. I'm Sierra. I'm 28. And for the first time in my life, I'm not anyone's mistake. I am exactly who I was meant to be. If this story of truth and ultimate justice moved you, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear that the truth always comes to light. For more incredible stories of standing up for what's right, subscribe to Silent Revenge Lab and turn on all notifications so you never miss a reveal. Thanks for watching. And remember, your past doesn't define you, but how you handle the truth certainly does.